Okay, so households are small. They're great places to do ethnography, and we're talking here mostly about households, urban households, mostly urban, not completely, in the developed world. So relatively affluent, well-off households. Uh, so they're both, in a sense, insignificantly tiny, but also the engine of the economic growth that drives global climate change. So a big challenge for us is how do you kind of scale up the ethnographic approach to more systematically think about bigger scale changes. So often householders will say, well, what can I do? We're just one little household, and look at the huge size of the problem. Now, we couldn't find any example of this having been done in relation to ethnography around environmental issues. So we think our study is the first, and we look forward to other comparisons with our study. But basically what you do is select your body of literature, and so we looked at the range of household research that had been done in Australia, looking for papers that fulfilled a number of clear criteria, including they discussed one or more environmental themes in relation to climate change or relevant to climate change. They were each of a separate household sample, and both the qualitative methods and the data were reported in sufficient detail in the peer-reviewed literature. So we ended up with 12 papers covering 276 households. And meta-ethnographies that we'd found in other areas vary between 2 and 44 studies, but are typically less than 10. So ours was kind of on the bigger end. Now, the methods used in these studies include a variety of things, including in-depth interviews, household tours, video diaries. So they're not all pure ethnographic studies in the sense of embedded living in the household. But this is relatively common, we found, in meta-ethnography. So it's not only about long-term immersive ethnography. One thing that was different in our study is that we ourselves were authors, or our students were authors on a number of these studies. So it does seem to be relatively unusual for people to do meta-analyses of work that includes their own work. And of course, you could argue there are strengths and weaknesses for that. There's a fairly well-established set of steps in the literature about how to do this. So we had a number of the authors independently coding the papers and then searching for themes. And we distilled the themes. I think we started with 9 themes and then distilled those down to 7. And then we got another author to kind of independently search for those themes in the papers as a kind of back-coding exercise. And the themes we ended up with were family, adaptiveness, autonomy, materials, boundaries, time, and paradoxes. The strength of our findings are really around the themes that are not actually environmental themes that come out and that might provide additional levers for kind of action or that highlight different kinds of barriers. So I'll just discuss a couple of those. The most positive implication we found is the strength of the adaptiveness of the households in our analysis. So clearly households are used to juggling a number of different challenges and streamlining different things. They have very strong adaptive capacities to cope with all sorts of things that are not necessarily environmental challenges but could be applied to climate change challenges. So the strength and the resources that exist in households, often in very kind of micro ways of looking after each other and so on, should be thought of as important resources across the community for dealing with climate change. And it does suggest perhaps that people have a greater capacity to deal with sacrifice, as long as it's shared sacrifice, and with the difficulties that are potentially ahead of us than governments probably give them credit for. 2 consistently complex themes around family and autonomy. Now, these can either increase or decrease the propensity to take adaptive actions or mitigative actions in response to climate change. So I think they do alert governments to, particularly the kind of autonomy and privacy area, alert governments to issues that might be more challenging than are expected. So that sense of the household, the family as being protected from the outside world and being a place of retreat from the outside world and relative freedom did come through in a number of studies. So there could be some insights there for government and policymakers to think of the difficulties that need to be addressed in that respect. And by the way, that's consistent with other cultural environmental research that shows the importance of privacy and freedom in everyday life. And the third one I'll just mention is the everyday temporalities, and I think that shows how there's both kind of resistance and creativity in the way people have to juggle time. So time, of course, is particularly an issue for women in households, and dealing with many overlapping responsibilities, many overlapping temporalities. So issues about habit and practice, routine, and so on come into play. And there's quite a bit of research, for example, around the use of the car in mediating the different responsibilities of everyday life for mothers of young children. So we can see that kind of friction of temporalities as being experienced by women, often many women who want to take environmental actions or use cars less, for example, but the pace of contemporary life is often commented on. So many households would welcome what they would refer to as a slower pace of life, but they're furled up into wider systems of structures with which the household is connected that make those things difficult.
I mean, the approaches that we've taken have been, although ethnographic, they're not necessarily conventional ethnography. Maybe they're closer to the sort of work which is done by a lot of design studios, a lot of design research teams. Although with the caveat that we weren't trying to get towards a best solution for these things, for the problems. But the sort of methods we've used have been things like cultural probes and design probes and kind of diaries for people, but not just noting what they do or what they've done, but also doing small kind of creative exercises to respond to particular questions, to respond to particular prompts in context of everyday activities. The main thing we did was a form of contextual inquiry where we go to where people are doing things. We visit people at home and ask them to show us, how do they use the devices? How do they use appliances in their home? Where people had, for example, in some of the work, the people we were studying had energy monitors. They had energy displays in their homes that told them, the cost or how many kilowatt hours they were using each day and so on. So we asked people to show us, how do you use it? How do you fit this into your life? We took a lot of photos. We took a lot of video of people. We interviewed people as kind of semi-structured interviews, ideally as far as possible in context of how they were actually doing things. We would say, show us how do you use the heating system? How do you adjust the controls on this? What routines do you establish? Who does it in the household? We also used a lot of methods around, and again, maybe this is not fully, conventional ethnographic methods, but we used quite a lot of methods involving getting people to do creative activities in the context of the question. So, the biggest study that we've done along those lines was around getting people to draw what they imagined energy looked like. So it's an investigation really of people's mental imagery or their imaginaries around the abstract concept. And we did that with householders in context in their homes and as part of their kind of diary sort of cultural probes study, but also at some public events. So we did an event at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. We did one with a group of teenagers at at a sort of science centre in Derbyshire, and a couple of others like that. So, in lots of cases, we're trying to get people to give us a more creative response. We don't just want to ask people, how do you use your washing machine? When do you do this? We're more interested in how people's understanding of the situations intersected with their actions, and how the design of the kind of systems around them reflected or didn't reflect that understanding, or in some cases helped to create it. I suppose another aspect is we tried as far as possible to integrate quantitative data from the energy use, where people's homes were being monitored, and it wasn't just energy, it wasn't just electricity and gas. In some cases, we had information around, data around temperature variation, even things like humidity variation over the day. So we could, in some cases, we were able to, a couple of studies, we were able to get people to integrate using timelines of their data to help talk us through, well, what was actually doing at that point and why. So we had a kind of, here's the quantitative data, here's a qualitative explanation for what was going on from the perspective of a household, rather than something assumed by someone externally. So I guess I've sort of explained the reasons why we did that alongside it, but the reasons were to try to provide that layer of qualitative explanation, really, to quantitative data, which is increasingly easy to obtain, but without the reasons behind it, we don't necessarily learn as much as we could.
On the LEADER project, we used a sensory ethnographic methodology as developed by Sarah Pink, and this rethinks traditional ethnography in a way that pays particular attention to sensory perception, to the interconnectedness of the senses, and also to knowledge as it's generated collaboratively with participants as we encounter them in embodied and in placed ways in the context of their everyday lives. There's no one prescribed way of doing sensory ethnography. In fact, it's a methodology that very much grows and develops in use. But sensory ethnographers tend to share an interest in innovative methods of research and representation that go beyond the written and spoken word, to also account for some of the tacit and spoken dimensions of everyday life and everyday experience. So in our research on LEADER, we used video as part of a number of ethnographic encounters with participants, including a home video tour, a video reenactments, and also what we called everyday activity studies, in which people showed us around the home and showed us, demonstrated to us how they do their laundry, how they do their cooking, how digital media are part of the sensory home, and so on. And we use these videos very much as routes towards imagining everyday life and people's sensory worlds at times when we weren't there to actively observe them. We also spent some time and used some more traditionally ethnographic methods of observation at participant homes, but we very much tried to directly engage with people. And we discuss our approach in more detail on our project website, energyandddigitalliving.com.
So I'm sure viewers could understand that ethnography was chosen in the original studies as a means to illustrate the depth and complexity of the issues at hand, and as a means to investigate the role of everyday life and the complexities of everyday life in households, which of course we all live through as well in our own lives. So in a sense we're all participant observers in our own lives. But this is particularly important in household perspectives on sustainability and on energy use. So it's not just the human practices in the household, but the way in which they integrate or not with systems of lighting and heating and the various forms of energy use. So we never understand the household as being separated from those broader systems, and an important theme in our research has been what we've called the connected household, so the way in which the household is connected to broader infrastructures, and also how the members of the household are embedded in wider social and economic structures of domestic and paid labour and so on. So it's relatively easy to understand why we would choose ethnography, or why the authors of the different studies chose ethnographic approaches. And we chose meta-ethnography because we were interested in the challenges of scaling up this kind of research and thinking of broader trends. I just want to read you a quote from Doyle, 2003, who argues that the key contribution of meta-ethnography is that it does not conceptually dismiss single case studies as locally bound, but rather compels us to acknowledge the importance of not only the uniqueness of individual cases, but also the uniqueness of collectives. That's from Doyle, 2003, page 340. So we were looking for those broader trends which might be able to start to characterise Australian mostly urban households. Now, of course, this is an initial study. There aren't any comparators yet, but it would be great to eventually have comparators in places like the USA, the UK, Canada, places that Australia would see itself as broadly comparable to, and see what differences and similarities existed. There are a number of difficulties we discussed in the paper. So although we conclude that meta-ethnography has considerable potential in this area, it still needs quite a lot of discussion and testing and broader comparison, we think.
The reason we chose ethnography to study domestic energy consumption, and specifically sensory ethnography, is that we think it's really important to get to the detail of how energy use actually happens in the context of everyday life. And some of those activities that require energy to be used are mundane. They're not necessarily ones that we often think or talk about. And a lot of how energy use happens has to do with people's sensory perception of their environment as well, and with very practical embodied knowledges that really come to the fore when we talk and walk through everyday activities with people in their homes. So they're tacit knowledges, things we know how to do but don't necessarily talk about. This is different from questionnaires and standard interviews, partly because we, as researchers, we bring our own sensory experience to the context of the home, but also because what people say they do and what they do can be quite different. This is partly to do with the wider moral and social discourses people engage with when they talk about energy use. But it's also because certain details might just not be remembered unless we bring people into the context of their home and actually get them to do things the way they would usually do them. And also because the contingent nature of energy-related activities means that people might save energy in one context but not in another. And there are also social dynamics at play that don't always come to the fore if not dealing with how energy use plays out in the context of everyday life.